The question about what's the role of the photographer is very deep and very interesting. And I think it has to start with a philosophical review of what is a photograph in the 21st century. And point number one, I'd refer anyone who's curious about that to Fred Richen's book, After Photography, where he really dissects the radical shift in the nature of the photograph, which has come with digitization. And it's a shift which I think many people haven't recognized yet, because it looks very similar to what was photography. One can use it in the same way as photography was used, but actually it's fundamentally different in many different ways. So philosophically, what the nature of a photograph is being a fixed piece of evidence, which is pretty much what photojournalism was in the 20th century. It's no longer the case. A photograph online or in a digital format, wherever it's positioned, becomes a very dynamic document which changes over time. It's no longer fixed. It's no longer even necessarily evidential, because it's treated with some suspicion about, is this real, is it being photoshopped, and all the rest of it. But it does have a role, absolutely, and a very powerful role. We just have to understand what the transition is. I think another transition is cultural, where the photograph, again, was a document. Whether we photographed ourselves for Facebook or photographed our family on our wedding to put in an album, or whether it was a photojournalist recording an event, that the notion of a photograph was a document, a fixed record. And one of the things which we have to be aware of is that the nature of a photograph now is more experiential, that people are making photographs for the experience of making the picture. It becomes very current. It's not a photograph is not always made for future reference. Very often a photograph is made for current experience. So the nature of how people relate to an image is absolutely changing, and that's not something which we can define. We must find our place in the culture, but we have to fit in with the culture, and how people read photographs is changing under our feet. So I think we have to adapt who we are, what we're doing. The notion of crowdsourcing, of citizen journalism, cell phones, all this stuff we're very familiar with at this point. It's all enriching, it's changing everything. And fundamentally, it's not about us as professionals telling the rest of the world how you must read a photograph. We have to be wise to how people are treating our material, because they have control of it. Once you put a picture in front of somebody, it's their interpretation, and how they interpret it is the meaning of the picture. And we can't, we can shape people's expectations, we can guide them, we can come at it with particular motives, but we also have to be very wise to how people are reading our imagery. And I think that fundamentally, the role of the photograph, or the role of the professional photographer at this point, has to be one of having something important to say. And there's a very old saying, which is that speak because you have something to say, don't speak because you have to say something. And I think there's another variation on that, which is writing. This is about authorship. Writing is so much easier if you have something to say. And I think that the dilemma is that if we consider our role as photographers of simply filling space, or of just making pictures to earn money, we are essentially hacks. But if we approach the position of being photographers because we have an important message, then the whole thing clarifies. And then it becomes a matter of how do we use this new media, how do we use the new economic structure to get our message out there. If we're stuck in the position of saying, well, I just have a box full of pictures and somehow people should be interested and I've got to make money out of it, then we're going to be in a very difficult position. And therefore I think the generic question of what is the role of the photographer becomes a very individual question. It's like, what is my role as a photographer? What am I trying to tell you? And that can vary for every one of us. It could be because I have an important message about malaria. It could be because I have exclusive access to Angelina Jolie. You're going to get everything in between. But it has to be very individual. I don't think one can prescribe a general role for the photographer in the 21st century, because it's now so fluid, so variable, so shifting with the technological shifts, the philosophical shifts, and the cultural shifts. I think all we can do is look at ourselves and say, what is it that I want to do? The rise of photojournalism as an industry was a market response. It started, humanitarian photography, documentary photography really started with a social cause. It became a profession. And I think now what we're suffering as an industry is that as the market has completely transformed, we're left with an oversupply of professional photographers, and that's really the complaint that we're hearing, is that there's an oversupply of professional photographers all trying to fill a shrinking number of pages, print pages, on which themselves have shrinking budgets. So what became a profession on the base of an economic structure, it was a market response, we're now having the opposite market response of, there's a winnowing, a filtering, and that those people who are dependent entirely on print for their income will necessarily struggle, and the number of photographers doing that will necessarily shrink. I would hope that the number of photographers overall will grow, and I hope also that the number of photographers earning a proper income will grow. But I think that the notion of feeding print and news organs in general will shift and change. But I think the opportunities are actually multiplying. But so long as one thinks of it in terms of print and magazines and newspapers, then it'll be a struggle. I think that the opportunities are really huge. And I've been very inspired, by the way, talking to a growing number of photographers who, under 25, have no expectation whatsoever of earning money from a magazine or a newspaper. And they listen to my stories about licensing and the decline of the market with awe and amazement, because it means nothing to them. It's a historical relic. So I think there's a generation of photographers coming into this market who from training, they're looking into other places. And I find that very exciting and very inspiring. Overall, I think the lesson is, have something to say. And it doesn't mean you have to have, incredibly important, serious. Having serious message is one thing to say. But one can also talk with humor. One can also talk about personal experience. One can talk about celebrity. I mean, these are all things to talk about. But, have something to say. And have imagination about how we say it. And I think that's really key, is that we come from, those of us in the older generation, come from a model which was monolithic. It was advertising-funded editorial. And that monolithic model is gone, and replacing it, we have an infinity of models. And I think that VII the magazine is one example. It's specific to VII. All the signs are that it'll work and it'll be good. It doesn't mean that that's the model. It's a model, and it works for VII. Other photographers with other aspirations will come up with other models, and every day I'm meeting people who are coming at this from a different point of view and inventing different ways of making it happen. I think that brand is very important, and that brand these days is relatively easy to acquire or develop, in fact. There's a saying that 50 years ago it took 50 years to develop a brand, 10 years ago it took 10 years to develop a brand, a year ago it took a year, and it's kind of an absurd reduction. But it's certainly true that working online, one can develop a brand very quickly, and by quickly I mean within a year. You can develop a profile and a recognized set of associations with your work, and that doing that is really important, and that relates to the previous two issues, which is having something to say and using imagination. And I think that developing a brand is easier if you have one line to nurture and to publicize, and if you have imagination about how you express it. I think with those elements it becomes easier to develop a brand. And with a brand and with something to say and with imagination, I think the opportunities are huge.